Hello, welcome. We're here with Dr. James Doty for a program called Compassion in the Digital Age. Dr. Doty is a clinical professor of neurosurgery at Stanford University and the director of the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford University School of Medicine. Welcome, Dr. Doty.
Well, thanks for having me, Steve. It's a joy to be with you today, and hopefully we'll all learn a little bit and maybe have a greater insight into what compassion really means.
Let's kind of dive in. What is the, I asked Siri earlier, what's the definition of compassion? And it was like less than a sentence. So what is compassion? What does it mean in the standard terms? And then maybe we can get into historically and its place in the world. But what is your definition of compassion?
As a scientist, we have to have boundaries around what we research, and that means there are definitions of everything that are fairly specific. So in regard to compassion, in the scientific world in this domain, the definition typically is a motivational desire to alleviate another person's suffering. So of course you have to recognize another's suffering, then have this desire to alleviate the suffering. Many people confuse empathy with compassion, and they are not the same. Empathy is taking on the emotional state of another, and it could be empathic joy. So it covers a broad range of emotional states, if you will.
Tell us a little bit about the Center for Compassion that you've been doing. How long have you've had that at Stanford? It's an incredible organization.
So we use the acronym CCARE, and it was founded in 2010. Prior to that, I had, in a more informal sense, been doing scientific experiments with neuroscientists, psychologists at Stanford. And what ultimately happened was I was walking through campus one day, and I suddenly had an image of the Dalai Lama, and this really almost a message saying you should have His Holiness come and speak. And I had little, if any, interest in Buddhism per se, and certainly would not define myself in any way in a religious context. But this image persisted, so I thought it would be interesting because, of course, many of us look to the Dalai Lama by his actions and words to be an icon of compassion. So long story short, I was able to get a meeting with His Holiness when he was visiting Seattle in 2007. And it was scheduled to be a very brief meeting, but in fact, we ended up talking for about an hour and a half. His Holiness immediately agreed to come to Stanford to give this talk and meet with the scientists who I had been working with. And then, extraordinarily, near the end of our conversation, he became quite animated and excited as we were talking about different research projects. And at the end, he began this conversation with Upton Jinpa, who's been his primary English translator for almost 3 decades now. And at the end of it, Jinpa turned to me and he said, "Jim, His Holiness is so moved by this effort that you've begun that he would like to make a personal donation." And at that time, he made a donation that was the largest he'd ever given to a non-Tibetan cause. And of course, it was quite overwhelming. And shortly thereafter, 2 individuals came forward who made significant donations. And basically that began the basis of the center at Stanford, which is now in its 10th year.
That's quite a story. I mean, generally it's, religious leaders are, taking donations. So the fact that it flipped and all of a sudden he found enough value in what you're doing. But I wonder, what do you think it was that, I would imagine what you're doing validated what his work is. And what do you think he saw in what you're doing that made such a difference?
Well, the Dalai Lama has a great interest in many areas, but one is neuroscience. He's had an interest in how meditation affects the brain. And I believe, if you will, it was the right time, both in regard to, excuse me, both in regard to how science, at least in regard to the study of this area, was advancing, and then the particular area that I had an interest in. And I think that piqued his interest, and he saw how if we can gain further insights into compassion, its effects on the brain, why we're compassionate, and demonstrate, if you will, the value proposition of that in regard to mental and physical health, that would have a very powerful impact in a secular world. And I think that was the motivating factor. I may have mentioned to you that now it's been almost a year, but CCARE, with me as the senior editor and two of the individuals who are affiliated with our center and two collaborators, we actually created the Oxford Handbook of Compassion Science, which Oxford University Press recently published. And it is the culmination of all the research in the field. And in fact, I think most people would consider it the Bible for the field in terms of the latest research, the terms of the work that has been done, and sort of where we are, if you will, in terms of state of the field. A decade ago, what's interesting is when I first began this work, I would talk to researchers, and they quite dismissively said that compassion was not a worthy area of study. And what's extraordinary is over the last decade, how that has completely changed. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of students who are interested in getting graduate degrees focused in this area. We have now affiliations with over 40 academic and research institutions who are studying this area. And the fact that Oxford University Press published what's called the Handbook of Compassion Science, I think all speaks to the fact that this emerging field is an extraordinarily important one.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of parallels with what's happening with mindfulness. I mean, because I know I've seen, bar graphs where they graph out the number of searches for mindfulness over the last 10, 20 years. And I think that coincided, I think John Kabat-Zinn mentions that 10, 15 years ago, there were 2 or 3 like research projects involved with mindfulness, and now there's dozens or hundreds. It sounds like compassion is in a similar situation in terms of how do you quantify something you can't touch or feel, and intuitively, it helps you, but I think all this kind of touchy-feely work that we're involved in, I think it gets real. One of the things we're trying to do with Wisdom Feed and Better Listen is to have StreetSmart wisdom, but you kind of kick the tires on it. Okay, and that's why I'm so interested and glad to have you here, is like you quantify it. So how do you quantify, okay, let me ask you let me ask you the same question in a different way. So in the handbook for compassion that Oxford just published, it sounds like it's a real dense research book, but what are the takeaways there? What's on the jacket, or what is relevant to anyone listening to this that kind of practical in their real life?
Well, let me back up a little bit and talk about a couple things. One is, you mentioned, and it's been said sometimes that, compassion is very soft, and how do you study that? And in fact, the reality is that there's a lot of pressure in the quote unquote soft sciences, psychology, et cetera, in regard to the replication of the a lot of the significant research that has been done, and whether, in fact, the boundaries of such research fall in the same domain as quote unquote hard science, like physics and math.
Well, is that like evidence-based kind of research? Is that a similar concept? Or?
Yes, that fulfills what we would think of as the normal criteria for scientific inquiry. You have a hypothesis, and then you test that hypothesis, and you collect the data, and then you make statements based on what that data demonstrates. But what we found is that in some of, again, the more soft sciences, that there has been a tendency to, I won't say manipulate the data consciously, but it's the boundaries of what is accepted as showing X, Y, or Z have probably been a little bit broader sometimes. The other problem is that as human beings, we of course have our own biases. And there are scientific researchers who are, if you will, quote unquote, hardcore meditators. And they have a fixed belief of the value proposition of this, like anyone who wishes that something is because of the effect it has on them.
Well, it's a bias. There's a bias. It's like a drug company doing tests on a drug. They have a bias for it to work because they have a lot of money riding on it.
And people have reputations. And as you probably know, science that demonstrates a negative frequently isn't published. It's only published if it promotes your agenda. And this is, of course, the tobacco companies are a classic example. The other side of compassion when we have these conversations is that it has traditionally not sat in the domain of science, but is associated with human behavior, religion, culture, etc. And what happens is that when you attract people who have belief systems that are not based on science, religion, if you will, it also can taint, again, getting back to the same bias. And so you have to be careful. And then if you're talking about that area, it's like alternative medicine. You know, there's medicine, there's alternative medicine, and ideally, when we use the term alternative, it means that it is a therapy, a medication that has not been used for X, Y, or Z, but now there's a body of evidence that is demonstrating potential usefulness. So it may have been a folk remedy, and of course many medicines come from folk remedies, that ultimately at the end of the day, doing hard science is proven to be beneficial. And so this is sort of the area of alternative medicine that's being explored, but the problem is it delves off sometimes into quackery. And the people in the quackery side of it want to push their interest into this domain of alternative. And in some ways, it's like compassion. There's a subset of people who want to define it a certain way or have wishes and desires, and they sort of want to push it and to say, well, see, look at science now. It shows what I say, even though they don't necessarily correlate. I think, though, that if you look at the evolution of compassion within mammalian species, and you look at the evolution or development of religion and culture and society, of course, you see the centrality of compassion, and that's not by accident. And the reason I say that is that because the science we now know, and in some ways you said it yourself, it seems so natural that the way we live, compassion's important, and it's absolutely true. And the reason that is because it serves a great purpose. And that purpose is to allow our species to survive and also to allow us to thrive personally. And it is this relationship of compassion between the individual who demonstrates compassion and the person who receives compassion and the power of that interaction affecting both individuals.
Wow. So, it makes me, so on one hand, when you have these kind of research, or people have their own biases looking at a specific body of data or research. So on one hand, it's amazing how you see, noticed things change over the years. If you're the herb company sponsor, that wants to show that alfalfa helps whatever, you're biased to, to make that work. And kind of conversely, now in a drug setting, I've seen a lot of examples kind of anecdotally of who cares what the science says. All I know is the thing that was killing me or bothering me, I tried alfalfa and I'm better. I tried, or vice versa. I tried alfalfa, didn't work. I tried the drug and it's better. So I think there's research. What I think is interesting is when the research kind of backs up the real world, and it doesn't necessarily always coincide. But
well, I think you're right. I think that what happens is looking at biases. Our belief has a huge impact on our physiology as well. And in fact, I should know I have a book called Into the Magic Shop, A Neurosurgeon's Quest to Discover the Mysteries of the Brain and the Secrets of the Heart, which, to plug that book briefly, but then to move on to what I was going to talk about, that's, of course, as you know, a New York Times bestseller. It's now on almost 40 languages, and it's won multiple awards. But I'm doing another book. And the other book, at least the tentative title, although I don't think it'll be the final title, is Out of the Magic Shop, The Power of Intention. And it, in some ways, addresses what you're talking about. Because the goal of that book is to, if you will, demonstrate the power each of us has to manifest. And we look at people like monks who can change their body temperature. There's a guy named Wim Hof who, can go out in a very cold environment and not be significantly affected. Hypnosis is an example of this profound ability we have to sort of change our physiology or change things. And the point is that a person's belief has a huge impact on what manifests. And this is, of course, the placebo effect we know very well in the pharmaceutical industry. And it addresses what you said. I mean, there's a subset of people, they may believe that alfalfa has an impact, and for a number of them, it will. And this has even been shown the case with cancer drugs. If somebody believes they're getting a cancer drug from a physiologic effect, they demonstrate in a subset of people the exact effect of that, the real drug. So it's quite profound. Now, nobody, of course, has yet, and this is an area of interest, is how do you gain access to this incredible power and ability we have to make things manifest, if you will, within our own physiology, but in fact, in the world around you. And that's what my other book is focused on. So yes, belief has a huge amount to do with many things, both positive and negative. But at the end of the day, we have demonstrable science that demonstrates the very powerful positive effect of being compassion to yourself in regard to physical and mental health.
Couple of things. So we work with, you familiar with Dr. Bernie Siegel?
Yes, sure.
Right. So he's 85 years old now, and he's on it as ever. So we just did one of these kind of programs with him, and he has not too many anecdotes. He's been doing this a long time. He's got some great stories. One of them, I won't get the science 100% right, but the essence of what he said was that there was this cancer treatment, medical-based hospital cancer treatment, and it was called EPOH or something like that. And the guy, one of the doctors administering it, changed the words around to call it hope. And there were clinical evidence that by just taking the treatment called hope, people did better, which and he backs it up with science. It all sounds woo-woo, but I think that's kind of, it speaks to the power of the mind and intention.
The sad thing in some ways, though, is that the average person does not take advantage of the extraordinary power they have within their mind. And it has to do, unfortunately, also with our evolution as a species, where oftentimes, instead of respond to these very positive events, it's the negative ones that are more sticky. And the reason that is of course, that positive stuff doesn't kill you. On the savannah in Africa 200,000 years ago, we lived as a species and our DNA has not changed, it's a negative event potentially resulting in loss of life or limb. So when negative events occur or you have those lessons, they are much more sticky to you because it means life and death. And on an intuitive, deep level, this is what happens. And unfortunately, it can also be negative emotional content, what people have said to you about what you can and cannot do. Situations where perhaps falsely, we created a narrative in our head that was negative, and it has stuck to us. And learning the power of what those negative emotional states or that emotional content can have on your physiology, in some ways can make you self-aware of these biases and give you tools that allow you to overcome them. And I call them brain bugs, these evolutionary brain bugs that exist with us based on our evolution on the savannah in Africa, but in the modern world are not helpful. And it's how do you overcome these brain bugs and, if you will, use our evolution and the biases and the different aspects of it to help yourself and to reach your full potential as a human being.
I love it. So we'll definitely try to get some of the tips for overcoming the brain bugs. It's almost like the wiring. Now, in your book, you talk about alphabet of the heart. You think that's something that is worth bringing up some of that now, or is that related? How do you feel about talking about that for a minute?
I was asked, and it was a great honor, to be the keynote speaker at an event at my medical school, which was called the White Coat Ceremony. And what a white coat ceremony is that prior to actually beginning medical school, typically the weekend before, the students are given a white coat, sometimes a stethoscope, and they take the oath of Hippocrates. It's an organized event. And those two things essentially, if you will, seal the deal on one's entry into the path of being a physician. And so it was an incredible honor to be asked to give that keynote address, which is given to an individual to hopefully inspire the students on their path forward. And I, in my own life, have had some significant challenges. And prior to that talk, I sat down and really thought through what it is that I could give these students in the context of not only leading the life of a physician in the right way, but also as a human being. And the other thing I recognized, obviously being a medical student one time myself, is that you need things that you can easily remember. And that's why in medical school, we learn mnemonics to remind us of body parts and nerves and vessels and things like this. So in that context, after a lot of thought, based on my own experience, I came up with 10 letters of the alphabet that I thought could help carry an individual if they sit with that and repeat it whenever they are stressed, anxious, or trying to reflect on their purpose in life. And it came down to the 10 letters beginning with C, ending with L. And this was done with great intention because it's also based on science. And it starts with C, compassion, and we defined what that was. But the other aspect of being able to be compassionate is you have to be compassionate to yourself. And this is this concept of self-compassion. So C is for compassion for self and others. We know that many people beat themselves up. They don't feel they're deserving of love or acceptance, and they have a negative image of themselves. And two things happen. One is that negative image limits you and affects your physiology. And two is it impedes your own ability to be kind to others, because if you're repeatedly hypercritical to yourself, it limits your own ability to be non-judgmental and accepting of others. So C is for compassion for self and others. D is recognizing the dignity of every person. Oftentimes there's a tendency to look down on others, to somehow think that how you live or who you are puts you in an elevated position above some other individuals. And this translates also into certain biases. And it's used, of course, in politics, religion, and other parts of our society to separate us and not bring us together. And this has to do with ego as well, the sense of self-import. So it also is an aspect of being able to give compassion, because to be compassionate, you're not looking down on another. That's pity. You are an equal. And when you're an equal, you're looking eye to eye. And that allows for acceptance. It allows for recognition that essentially we're all the same. And typically also in regard to our motivations and goals, we want to live our lives. We want to have food and shelter and security for our families. And actually, if you have that without the interference or if you will, the reality or creation of a sense of a lack of abundance, most people are quite happy. And so dignity, E is for equanimity. What happens is that, and this has to do with emotional regulation, it has to do with the nature of life, where we have big variations in our sense of happiness or our sense of being unhappy. And this unevenness of temperament, where you have some event occur that's very positive and you want to sit and be bathed in this warmth of feeling so good about what just happened, you know, it's very transitory. And when you want to have that all the time, of course, it creates grasping and desire, and it will also lead to jealousy. And of course, the other aspect is that all of us are going to have negative or down events happening in our lives. Now, the extraordinary thing about that is, of course, no one wants to have those because they're painful and on many, many levels. But if you actually reflect on those periods in your life where you've had this down event occur, one, of course, you realize it's transitory. And two, on deep reflection, you realize that you perhaps learned an incredible lesson that you carry with you that gives you more self-awareness and insights into yourself and human behavior. And this idea of equanimity, recognizing this reality and not getting lost in the desire to have everything perfect and great and be happy, nor running away as fast as you can to avoid pain, that then keeps you with a sense of the true nature of reality, which is all of these things are going to occur. None of us can prevent them. And when you have insights into the extremes and how they can help you and not help you, then you're much more calm because you don't fear them either. So that's equanimity. And then F is forgiveness. And what happens to so many of us is that an individual will have done an act which has made us extraordinarily angry. And there's a tendency, because we think oftentimes that our memory is a photograph of the actual event. And then we put that memory away. And every time we see that person's face or relive that event, we think that's a photograph of what happened. And what it is it's a black and white picture which we have painted with our own emotional content. And that's the thing that we think is reality. If you look at instances that we've all been in where somebody's made you angry, if you were to put yourself in the other person's position, you would understand why they're angry, right? And rightly and wrongly. I mean, all of us have done negative behaviors towards others based on not that we think we're a horrible person who just randomly does it, but because they're completely justified. And many of the times, the people who are on the receiving end are looking at us saying, what a horrible person we are. Why did you do that? And again, if you switch positions, it all seems perfectly justifiable. But the other side of that, which is this changing your perspective, is that when you carry these negative emotional states, again, as we were talking about earlier, they have a negative effect on your physiology. And some people use the analogy that carrying anger and hostility towards another is like drinking poison and somehow thinking that it's going to affect the other person. And the problem is, of course, it doesn't. It only affects you in a negative way. So you're sort of poisoning yourself, but it also clouds everything. When you're angry, when you're hostile, you hijack your prefrontal cortex, our executive control area. So you diminish your ability to have discerning judgment because you shift from sort of this relaxed mode without fear to one of fear, anger, hostility, which of course stimulates your amygdala and your flight or fight response. And then you are being reactive. And as a result, it only will worsen the situation. So there's forgiveness and gratitude. We know in a variety of studies that having gratitude for what you have, again, has a very, very positive physiologic effect. What happens to so many, and what I alluded to a little bit earlier, is that if you have shelter, security, food, your family's safe, you do a job that's meaningful, the vast, vast majority of people don't need anything more than that. They don't need to be billionaires. They don't need to be millionaires. And in fact, some of the happiest people, if they have those other criteria filled, want nothing more, and they have very, very humble circumstances, and they are very happy people. The problem is that there's a tendency, especially in modern society, because Western society is a conspicuous consumption society, we compare ourselves and this false notion of what is happiness to things. And we look at other people who may have a bigger house, a bigger car, a bigger paycheck, and we want that. And that wanting, again, this craving is negative. If you look around you, and you and I sitting here today, we are better off than probably 95% of people in the world. Half of the people live on $2.50 a day or less. Well, I mean, if you make that comparison, we are the most blessed people in the world. How could you want for anything? In fact, it's almost the holidays here, and there's nothing that I need, nothing that I want. other than, of course, friendships, relationships, love. But in the context of items or things, I want for nothing. The next letter is H, and this is for humility. We talked about dignity, recognizing you're an equal. And this is truly how to connect and give love to another. But humility is this idea that some of us feel that who we are, our position, is somehow exalted above another. And I tell my residents, these doctors who are going to become neurosurgeons, you simply need to walk down the hallway and watch how the nurses react to different doctors, or vice versa. In my own position as a neurosurgeon, I recognize that the orderly, the nurse, every person who works in that environment are part of a team, and I cannot be successful without their support. And I'm thankful. You'll watch other physicians walk down and they don't know anyone's names, they've made no efforts, they're demanding, and they somehow think that they should be the center of attention, and that what they do is the most important thing in the world. And again, that idea, doing those types of behaviors, actually, like all negative emotional states, if you will, this egocentric aspect or nature of us stops us from seeing the true nature of reality. Which is that we are all equal, we're all connected, we all want the same things, and everyone is deserving of recognition and love. And so H, humility, or this motivational desire to be humble and not take yourself too seriously. And then I is integrity, having a set of values that you have defined as important and which you live within in terms of how you interact with the world. And again, trying to be non-judgmental, accepting, being able to give love. All of these things make for a life. If you always have fear and anxiety, which we talked about in the context of self-compassion, what it does is it interferes with your ability to sort of integrate those values into who you are truly and how you reflect in the world. Because as a side effect of our evolution, human beings have the ability to intuit people's emotional states based on microfacial expressions in milliseconds. Your body language, your body habitus, even your smell, all are sent out to others in the world. And in my book, I talk about how I used to carry an immense amount of fear, anger, hostility, and as a result, this reflected in how I interacted with the world, and as a result, how the world interacted with me. And when I changed how I felt about myself, that changed how I walked in the world, if you will. And then that changed how the world interacted with me. And in fact, allowed me ultimately to be, quote unquote, successful in life. And that's not simply by having, social or financial success, but I mean being successful in the sense of hopefully being a more self-aware individual about my interaction with others in the world, and how those interactions, if they're positive, positively affect me and positively affect others. So that's integrity. And then justice in the context of our responsibility, because we are blessed to have a sense of justice or fairness in the world, and an understanding that because we are blessed, because we're fortunate, that we have a responsibility to care for those who are vulnerable. And then lastly, love, which essentially is the holder for all that I talked about. There's actually a 12-part podcast that goes into the science of this that can be found on the book website, intothemagicshop.com/podcast. And one of my students and I did this series, and many have found it quite powerful. The other thing I would share with you to show you the power of such things is that a few months after I gave that talk, I received an email from a woman who she said, I'm a person of faith. I'm the spiritual director of the largest homeless shelter in the United States. And I was burned out at my job. And the day I was packing up my belongings, you know, my friends had sent me scripture and all sorts of things to sort of help me overcome this feeling of burnout and just being at the end of my rope. She said, on my last day at work, someone shared with me your talk, and it was so powerful, it gave me the strength to return to work, which was incredibly deep and profound, and I was in tears, right? So I responded to her, and a few months later, she sent me another email, and she said, you know, we began using this practice, if you will, with our clients at the homeless shelter, and it's been very powerful for so many of them. We do it every morning, and I again sent her another email. She sends me a third email, and she says, you know, I told my best friend about this because it's been so powerful for me, and her 9-year-old daughter was there. And Jenny, this young lady, she makes beads. And as you know, malas, prayer beads are present in every religion. So this young lady took upon herself to make a set of compassion beads based on this alphabet of the heart with 10 wooden beads, but on her own, she added a golden bead to represent the golden rule. And she said, would you mind if we share or sold these as a fundraiser? And of course I was moved, and I said, of course. And so those have been spread all over the world. And she ultimately did a video about this. And if you look on the web, you'll find under Compassion Beads San Antonio, which is where this homeless shelter is, this video. And it shows this beautiful video of this young lady's hands on a golden cloth where she lays down a string and she lays down the beads. And this woman, her name is Ann Helmke, the Reverend Ann Helmke, she actually narrates, and she says, and this is a reality that we know through neuroscience, that compassion is very powerful in terms of affecting your physiology in a positive way. And she says, we also know through studies of neuroplasticity that through repetition and intention, we can create and support and strengthen neural pathways, and you can do so with compassion. And as she's talking about this, it shows this young lady stringing these beads. And it's really quite a beautiful video, and it was a very...
We'll put the links for that along with this program for sure. And that kind of, first of all, that was wonderful. I've never heard you go through the alphabet of the heart like that succinctly. That, which is a perfect segue into my next kind of question, and is, you know, is that the right word? Efficaciousness of compassion. You know, this person was able to see her world in a different way, and she didn't quit her job. So, and I guess the other, the second part of that question is the neuroscience, like the proof of it. But in the real world, why is it efficacious? Why is it useful in life to be compassionate?
This brings us sort of back where we started, which is evolution. And what separates humans from other mammals, and you notice I don't say superior to other mammals, is that we have something called theory of mind, the ability to understand that other individuals have independent thought from our own. we have abstract thinking, and we have complex language. And that really is what separates us. But the other aspect of this is when you have those attributes, which caused our cortex to enlarge, which resulted in a smaller litter, which has resulted in an absolute requirement that our offspring are taught, if you will, or mirror our behavior for 12, 15 years. And this is this whole idea of this mirror neuron system. How to be a human is not imprinted in their genes per se. The environment, that interaction with another, is absolutely critical for their survival and who they become. And because there's an immense requirement in terms of time and energy resources in the context of caring for your offspring, there has to be some motivator for you to do it. And what happens is that you are rewarded when you care for another. And there are a variety of different neural pathways, but one of the neurotransmitters that's often mentioned is oxytocin, the nurturing, love, caring hormone, if you will. And what happens is that as a species, we are very social. And when an individual has a release of oxytocin, not only do they feel this warmth and good feeling, this pleasurable feeling, but they have an affiliative response, meaning want to care, embrace, hug another. And but I say that with a caveat, in that certainly in the context of your own children and family, that's very true. In the context of people who you define as within your tribe, whatever definition of tribe you were using, you have that feeling. If it is somebody, though, that is not in your tribe, not of your family, you will not have any response. So it brings up another interesting point. The point being that, and as we were discussing evolution, until 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, our primary survival strategy as a species was to live in groups of 10 to 50 in a tribe. And the same characteristics in terms of mirroring other people's behaviors, the ability to intuit whether someone is suffering, if you will, or their emotional state based on looking at them and their body language or facial expressions, was just as critically important. Because if somebody in your tribe was not happy or suffering, that could impede them in regard to doing their job, and as a result, put the tribe at risk. So the same characteristics that allowed you to nurture your offspring, to care for them, to keep them out of danger, were just as critically important. And then, of course, as our tribes got larger through the creation of culture and society and religion, there started to be some degree of breakdown, because you can only extend it so far. On the other aspect is, and this is, we were talking about brain bugs, is that this tribal instinct on the one hand, which has been critical for our survival, and also even today, you know, when we are around people who think like us, look like us, act like us, it gives us psychological safety. And especially in the context where there is a reality or a created narrative of scarcity. So this tribal instinct is very important, but being aware that that tribal instinct can also make you blind or biased towards narrative that support or justify your behavior, it exists. And if you will, to be able to see the true nature of reality, to not wear opaque glasses where you're only seeing part, or that part which makes you feel good, you have to understand these different aspects of our fragility as a human being. and then to live in the world and really care and to really see, you have to take this tribalism or this instinct towards tribalism away. Certainly can be very valuable in terms of survival, but can also impede you from really living in the world and really caring.
And I think it creates the whole us and them. I mean, on one hand, it's good for surviving and thriving and keeping everyone fed and housed, but it can that also lead to war or lead to?
Of course it does, and this is why when I was gave the caveat to be self-aware, to be insightful of this, and use tribalism for its positive benefits. But if certainly that tribalism is what has led essentially to every war. Being able to overcome those biases, being able to see that essentially all of us are the same with the same motivations and desires. And look, the reality is, as an example, in the United States, we spend more than the next 26 countries combined in terms of armaments, right? 26 countries, the other 26 major leading countries in the world, we spend more than all of them.
Believable.
Which is insanity. We know that 40% of processed food is wasted. We know that the United States, as an example, uses 25% of the world's resources, yet has what percentage of people? 360 million out of 7.8 billion. And so we create a narrative that supports and justifies our behaviors to live in the world. But if you're more self-aware and thoughtful, then you can make the world a much better place for everyone, because there is plenty of food, there's plenty of shelter, there are plenty of resources to have everyone live a life of abundance.
One thing that made sense to me or jumped out at me when you were talking is mirroring. The concept of mirroring. I guess that's an unconscious thing that people just start to do in a community, in a tribe. So in a sense, I think one of the real life takeaways or the real life meaningful benefits of being compassionate or exhibiting compassion is that you model it for other people. And there's more compassion in the group. So is that what mirroring is? It has to do with modeling? And I'm married 17, 18 years, and my wife is...
You better pick which one, because she'll get mad at you. You better know which one.
18 years next month. 18 years next month. And I learned this Hebrew word called dugma, which is the Hebrew, it's an example. I have kids, and you want to be a good, perhaps compassionate parent to model that. And I think that's part of the practicality of being compassionate in the world. It's because there's more compassionate people around you. Now, is that selfish, or is it practical, or is it both?
Well, the Dalai Lama says that being compassionate is one of the only times where it's okay to be selfish. What he means by that is that when you're actually compassionate to others, you're benefiting, right? So when you're doing good, you're receiving good back. And certainly that's been my experience. And again, we know that when individuals observe other individuals being compassionate, there's a tendency for them to act better, be better. And I think this is natural. We see it over and over again. And look in our present political environment. You can do negative modeling. And, we have a president who has promoted, if you will, racism and separation, scarcity, and blame on others. And we see a huge uptick, if you will, in negative behaviors towards immigrants, towards Jews, towards minorities, towards whoever they define as not them. We have an empowered, toxic right-wing evangelical Christian community who
And,
makes.
and not only that, I don't think I've ever heard the term compassion in the same breath as
Well,
what's
that's
going
exactly
on.
right. It's the antithesis of compassion, and you see how horrible it is. And look who is identified with almost all of those people. To a self-aware, unbiased person would be hypocritical, toxic, negative, self-serving. Some people use the term a grifter. Um, simply taking advantage of a situation and literally forcing. It's always amusing to see these right-wing evangelical Christians talk about Sharia law and how Muslims are horrible, yet they wish to inflict and force their worldview on others. And that's one example. Certainly it's not the only example. And there's certainly people in the evangelical community who are absolutely wonderful. And in fact, there are people who are in the more right-wing part of the political agenda, if you will, who are actually thoughtful, kind, wonderful people. But unfortunately,
Compassionate even. It's
yeah,
not mutually exclusive. We're not.
absolutely not. And so the sad part, though, is that those individuals, like the majority of Americans, their view of the world is drowned out by this toxic negative behavior. Yet we know that the world could not function. We could not survive as a species unless, in fact, over 95% of people actually do the right thing. They care for others. They show up for work. They're kind to others. They are thankful. They have gratitude, et cetera, et cetera. That's what really makes the world go around. This other group of people makes up a very small minority that gets attention. But we know through a variety of studies and looking at other species that sort of these types of negative narratives may offer some benefit in the short term, but in terms of long-term survival, it's not a survival strategy.
It's not a recipe for longevity and
No.
wholeness in any way, shape, or form. I have another question. We could keep going on that for a while, but I think that it speaks to modeling the right way to be in the world. And it's interesting because sometimes, and this is, I think His Holiness talks about it. I'm not sure if there's specific stories, but even Martin Luther King, by modeling compassion or doing the right thing in the world, it's louder than all the noise in some ways. And what comes around goes around. And I have all these, Brooklyn kind of sayings that I grew up with. And one of them is do the right thing. So I think doing the right thing kind of takes the essence of a lot of what we're saying. And, what does it mean to do the right thing compassionately or at work or in society? And
well, we have this thing, what would Jesus do, right?
right.
And whatever example you wish to use, that's exactly right. When you look at others who are models of behavior and restraint and thoughtfulness and gentleness, it makes you feel good to be around those people. And when you're around those people, you have a tendency to act like them because it makes you feel good. Sadly, when people act base and self-serving, they attract the same type of people because, there are no ethical boundaries or there's no integrity. It's just, I have to win, you lose. And it's all about me. It gets back to humility, it gets back to dignity and some of the other values that we were talking about.
In this overly digitized world, how does compassion, what does compassion have to do with it? Like I was doing a similar conversation with Thomas More, who wrote Care for the Soul. And I was like, does my iPhone have a soul? And he was like, of course it does, if you do soulful things with it. If you're communicating, if you're living compassionately. But so in some ways, it's all neutral to how you deal with it. But what is compassion's place in this overly digitized world? I know you have kids, and there's a whole neuroscience behind how you kind of get lost in the device and addicted to it. But what does compassion have to do with the digital world?
Well, I think there are a couple things to reflect on. As you pointed out, it all has to do with how you treat it and how you interact with it, right? As Mr. Moore alluded to as well. But the other aspect is, and we sort of keep coming back to this evolution, right? So if you notice, as we evolved as a species and ultimately culture, society, et cetera, developed, the idea of convincing others to do things was very primitive at first, right? You either took it or ultimately later bartered for it. And then as people realized, if you will, our brain bugs or how to take advantage of our weaknesses, this is how we developed marketing and selling, right? Mm-hmm. And so nowadays, our insights and knowledge of human weaknesses and how to access people's subconscious, and this is the concept of free will. You know, we have a perception, excuse me, that the decisions we make have a relationship to our consciousness. But the reality is that well over 95% of all the decisions we make have to do with priming and, if you will, not necessarily conscious logic behavior. And in fact, a variety of studies have shown that we create narratives to justify our decisions after the decision has been made. And
I have to interrupt you because I know this is just maybe sacrilegious, but today happens to be my birthday and I'm old and getting older, but
happy birthday.
Saying, thank you. With basketball players, the older I get, the better I was. So you talk about there's a narrative you put around what happened. I think that's, you were kind of alluding to that in the stories we tell ourselves, and we kind of how we represent that.
Right, they're false. And in fact, you can have, I'm sure you've had the experience of being at an event and then years later, 2 or 3 people get together, discuss it, and your idea of what actually happened is completely different. And you're all there. And I've been in situations where people talk about things I did or said or an action I did to help them, which I have no recollection of whatsoever, but they have a very clear perception of what happened there. And I don't know, frankly, what happened for real. And, this is what they say. People don't remember what you say, they remember how you made them feel. So you have all these distractions. And while some people say, I'm a multitasker, the reality is none of us are good at multitasking. And being constantly interrupted has a very negative effect. And what I was also getting back to, this idea of marketing, is we know so much more now about how to prime people to get them to do what we want. And in a capitalist society, we have very sophisticated marketing campaigns to get you to do stuff and make you think you want to do them. And whether it's just outside marketing, but even how your phone works. These are very sophisticated people who want you on your device 24/7 because they make money. And sadly, as we see with the recent travels of Facebook, they'll do anything to make money. And it's always amusing to me where they go, oh my gosh, there was a rogue group within our organization that was taking data or doing X, Y, and Z, which is a joke.
Surprise, surprise, right?
Yeah, I mean, very consciously, with intention, they do these actions, they hide them, and then, of course, they're contrite when they're caught. And there's a saying that says, when I'm paid for a certain outcome, seemingly that outcome occurs more than just by chance, right? And, whether it's in the medical device world where I put medical implants in, the salespeople have a great motivation for me to do that. And if my income increases fourfold by me doing that, you create a narrative that justifies, many people do that type of behavior. As an example, again, in the area of medicine, it's extraordinary. What a shock when a group of doctors own a imaging device, the utilization of that particular device goes up several fold than their normal ordering patterns before they own the device. And of course, it's only because they get money from it. Yet, if you were to talk to them, they will tell you that they're ethical and moral and they would never consider doing anything like that. But it happens over and over again, and you don't even appreciate it. And this is why you have to always be constantly aware of our tendency to see what we wish to see. And it's also important that we make an effort to put ourselves in other people's perspectives. Because most of the time, if you can just sit with somebody for a little while, even somebody who has a diametrically opposed worldview, if you sit with them and are non-judgmental, you can get an understanding of why they do what they do. And most people are not bad people. It's just that
They're back on the savannah, and it's survival. They don't have to fight off the tiger, but they need to pay their mortgage. It's
right.
Survival.
Well, and sometimes, though, they'll do actions well beyond just paying their mortgage, as you know.
I'm sure. I'm just saying that's the instinct.
Yes.
So fascinating. So I think you kind of touched on it, and if there's anything else you would like to cover, let me know. But I think the idea of brain bugs, maybe briefly what they are and how to deal with them to be more effective in the world.
One of the aspects of this idea of brain bugs is, these internal biases. And I think that there's about 27 of them that have been clearly defined. There may be more, maybe a little less. But again, it's this idea, though, that you have to be vigilant about your own biases to have you see the world clearly, and and you're not going to extinguish them all, but you can arm yourself and understand them, which will decrease the likelihood of them occurring. And if you're presented with them, you'll be much more attuned to respond in the right way. It's interesting, as an example, people talk about white privilege, right? Of course, if you've not lived in a black person or shoes or minority shoes, you take all of these instances in the world where seemingly everything works right for white people, and they don't work for people of color. And then, of course, many white people will say, well, they're just hypersensitive, or that was, one instance, and it's not really true, and I shouldn't be punished for this thing that isn't real called white privilege. But, the data is indisputable. And when those same white people are put in a situation, as an example, through virtual reality, which makes them a minority or an immigrant, and they see the facial expressions of how people react, they get treated in the exact same way. Amazingly, they suddenly get insight and more self-aware and actually more kind. But because, again, there's a tendency to dismiss it, it's like being a fish in water. You don't know you're in water, so you're not particularly worried about your water as long as it's clean water, right? And that's the nature of these biases. So certainly taking the time to be self-aware about that and to not get caught up in your own ego and this issue of being right. I mean, the greatest gifts you can give to yourself, which translates into others, is be non-judgmental, and giving people unconditional love. And if you can strive to be that person, everything else in your life will fall into place. And we know that when people act compassionately, and you may be aware that we've developed at CCare a compassion cultivation training program, and we've done a number of studies on that. When you are compassionate to yourself, it allows you to be more compassionate to others. But just as importantly, your physiology changes. The expression of inflammatory proteins that are associated with the occurrence of disease, associated with chronicity of disease, associated with severity of disease. When you're kind and compassionate, the expression of those dramatically decreases. The stress hormones of cortisol and another interleukin-6 and other markers of stress, again, dramatically decrease. And we know that when these are chronically elevated, they have a very, very negative effect on health. They affect cardiac function, peripheral vascular function, the occurrence of disease, and even they affect your telomere length. They decrease your longevity. So there's all sorts of benefit when you actually practice compassion with intention. And this is what we teach. And if for those who may not have read my book, which is a memoir about the challenges in my own childhood and how I met somebody at the age of 12 who allowed me to change my perspective on how I saw the world. When I changed how I looked at the world and was more kind to myself, was more open and accepting and non-judgmental, the world changed how it reacted to me. And the fundamental nature of the change of that perception, and it gets back to the very start of our conversation, how you respond to things, the emotional content you bring to things, changes everything. And people don't appreciate the extraordinary, extraordinary power they themselves have within them, that they essentially have either given away in the sense that they listen to the limitations that others wish to place on them, or they've given up. And if you say to yourself, I can't, we know 100% that you won't. And, you know, negative self-talk or lack of compassion for yourself, it's like, you know, laying a brick down every day to build a wall around yourself, and eventually the wall pushes in, it starts getting dark inside that cell, and then of course you see everything about the world in a negative way. Yet you're the person who is putting those blocks down, and you have certainly the capacity to actually walk out the door of that self-created prison. And I think that's an important understanding that a lot of people don't have. But it's only when you're kind to yourself and give yourself love and believe you're worthy of love that you can manifest all of this power you have.
That's a great place to stop. And even just learning in these words the power and importance of compassion and self-compassion. So good place to stop. So thank you, Dr. Doty. Anything else, or is that good?
Well, I'm sure you and I could chat for a long time here.
Okay, so that's great. Thanks so much, and we'll see you later.
Okay, you take care. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.